to this new investigation by Annabelle Underwood. Today, we are taking you deep into a distant journey, into a wide, mysterious, and unpredictable land, along grandiose landscapes, unpredictable encounters, and buried secrets. Annabelle will once again be faced with a troubling mystery. Make yourself comfortable and let yourself be drawn into this new adventure, where the beauty of nature stands beside the shadow of mystery. Here is Annabelle Underwood 6th investigation, A Deadful Trap. So now I will summarize the first part for you, but if you want to listen to it, you can find the link in the description. So, Annabelle is writing from Canada before the final stage of the journey to the North Pole. She describes the beauty of the forests and lakes and introduces the members of the expedition. A violent storm forced them to take shelter in a wooden trading post. In the morning, a scream wakes them. A human skeleton has been discovered outside. So now I'm reading the letter again. After the shock of finding a skeleton in the middle of the forest, I asked everyone to help me recover the different bones so that we could recreate it. Indeed, without having analyzed it yet, the visible impact on the top and back of the skull suggested that this person had probably not died of natural causes. A murder? An accident? It was still too early to say, but one thing was certain. He had been dead for several months already, but no longer than that. Hayden confirmed my assessments, speaking of 6 months at most. Within a few hours, the bones were gradually discovered in the surrounding area. The skeleton was almost complete by the time the sun was nearing its zenith. No one was really speaking. Some murmured a few words, still somewhat in shock. After all, it is not every day that one comes face to face with a skeleton. We were missing only a few pieces of the tibia, which seems to have been shattered into several fragments the previous night during the storm, one of the 2 humeri and several phalanges from the right foot. We, nevertheless, had more than enough to analyze the bones and determine the cause of death. I simply hoped that we might later find the rest of his remains so that we could give him a proper burial. All the remains of this dead man were brought inside, while the others prepared a light meal. We had not eaten since the day before. Once our stomachs were filled, Hayden and I began to inspect this body, while the others continued exploring the surroundings in hope of finding the last missing parts. We gradually reconstituted the body, placing the bone one by one on the table, which has been covered with a white sheet. Hayden was far more knowledgeable than I was in this area. He possesses a solid foundation in medicine and anthropology, knowledge I do not yet have. I would be delighted to learn in his company. During his years in the police force, he had the chance of meeting fascinating people who taught him these precious skills. As for me, as you can imagine, I had far more difficulty gaining access to such knowledge. It was mainly experience and my various adventures that taught me. After the death of my parents, I found myself stuck, living with my grandfather in Scotland for a few years. And even though I love being with all my heart, it is true that his ideas are still rather gendered and conservative. So, there was no question of me touching medicine or human bodies, but drawing and music that was perfectly acceptable. Still, you will see that drawing can be most useful, for with a simple skull, it is possible to reconstruct a person's entire face. But one thing at a time. Let us first return to Hayden's analysis, which I've transcribed for you below. Hayden had used his camera to take several photographs of the bones. He photographed them methodically and as carefully as possible. Once his step was complete, he sat down to analyze them. To help himself examine the various visible impacts on the body more closely, he took from the inside pocket of his coat a most astonishing object, a cross between a magnifying glass and a portable microscope. Then he started to speak. From all the parts of the skeleton before me, I can draw several conclusions. First, as you can see here, Anna, the pelvis is somewhat narrower and more vertical, which proves that we are most likely dealing with a male skeleton of about 1 meter and 70 centimeters. The shape of the skull also seems to support this, which is more prominent broad ridges on the forehead that is more sloped than round. The same is true of the pelvic bone, which shows a rather narrow sciatic notch on the flat auricular surface. So you know, I am far from being an expert on this field, but I am almost 100% certain that we are dealing with a male skeleton. And if we look at the degree of closure of the cranial sutures and the femur bones, which are not yet completely fused, it's proof that he could not have been more than 25 years old. I would even say barely 20. Good Lord, he was just a boy. He paused before continuing. This revelation weighed on him far more than I expected. He stood up and went outside for some fresh air. I followed him in silence, and for long minutes we simply contemplated the landscape. We admired the wind blow gently through the leaves of the branches and the moss on the ground. The birds had resumed their song and were delighting our ears with some smoothing melody. Seeing such an idyllic and peaceful thing, it was difficult not to be struck by the contrasts with what was happening inside. Just as I was about to speak and offer him a few comforting words that might lift his spirits, he turned back. A few seconds later, he was once again absorbed in his work and resumed speaking, continuing the thread of his observations. Next, we can observe that he was not born with any deformities and had not suffered any other trauma before his death. He was well fed through his life and experienced perfectly normal growth for a young boy of his age. He had not even broken a bone while alive. There are no visible fractures apart from the one inflicted several months ago before he died. Fourthly, we can observe the trauma to the bones linked to his death. He presents 2 powerful impacts to the skull, which pierce the cranium, as you can see here, Anna, on the top of the skull and at the back. I believe these 2 blows were fatal to our unfortunate young man, and although I cannot yet say so with 100% certainty, I think we are dealing with a murder rather than an accident. That would explain the marks and impacts on his body is only the bones of the forearm, but also on the various phalanges on his fingers. It looked through he was trying to protect himself from someone attacking him with a very hard and very resistant object, like a metal pipe, a baseball bat, perhaps even the butt of a rifle. I need to continue studying the body, but I sincerely believe we are dealing with murder. The marks show that the Cupid did not hesitate much and savagely attacked this poor adolescent without giving him the slightest chance of getting out alive. And lastly, judging by the condition of the bones, I believe the body was not buried but left to decompose in the open air, in the middle of nature. You can see here the marks left by the beak of birds, of scavengers, he say, showing me tiny cuts on the surface of the bones. Perhaps turkey vultures, large scavengers present in this forest, and the missing parts may have been carried off by larger predators. As the impacts you can see on the malleus and the scapula might suggest a lynx or a coyote perhaps, but they are only suppositions, I do not yet know the fauna of these regions well enough to be perfectly certain, but it is very much resembles the marks left by animals on a body that has just been lost its soul. I have already seen these kind of things, though not the same species, of course, in the United Kingdom. In any case, I was convinced that the body was not buried, but indeed left in the open air to decompose. The murderer fled without taking the time to give the victim a respectful burial. I will try to see whenever I can find other details that might tell us a little more about our victim, but I think I have given you the most important information, especially since this is not my specialty at all. An anthropologist or a forensic doctor would surely be able to tell you far more than I can. He fell silent again as I thanked him, and immediately plunged back into his work, inspecting every detail of the bones with his microscope magnifier, searching for the slightest information that might have escaped him. After a few moments, as I saw that he was focusing on the marks left on the lateral malleolus, the one at the ends of the fibula, I asked whenever he would let me borrow the skill for a moment, so that I might attempt, and I do mean attempt, to recreate a face. It was an exercise I had not done in years, but one I had been fortunate enough to learn during anatomical drawings lessons in Scotland with our private tutor, since grandfather had refused to let me enroll at the Lady Literate in Arts. I had the good fortune to come across a wonderful teacher who had understood that I only liked anatomy in humans when it was connected to an investigation that allowed me to discover the face of some unfortunate unknown person from history. It was thus, thanks to my teacher and to myself, that we were able to reveal the features of a woman who had drawn a few leagues from my home. We were thereby able to find and arrest her murderer. But once again, I am digressing. And it has been quite some time since I handled a pencil. Taking my research notebook and a graphite pencil from my pockets, I first began to trace, as identically and faithfully as possible, the skull before me. I tried to erase the traumas that had made certain pieces of the skull disappear in order to recover its original shape. Once the skull was finished, I began drawing the eyeballs, then the nose and his nasal cartilage, then come all the muscles that make up the face. Dozens and dozens of muscles gradually gave shapes to my drawing. I added the lips, then the ears and the skin, a little hair to make him seem more alive. I drew several possibilities, adapting the shape of the nose, the mouth, the ears, and the hair. I added a little pigment with a few colored pencils I had had the good idea to bring on our journey. Pleased with the results, especially since with my last drawing, I turned it around to show Hayden and ask his opinion. Before I continue, I prefer to warn you, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce a new name, so I will try to do my best. So now I'm reading the letter again. No sooner had I returned my drawing around than a cry rang out from the entrance. The men had returned with the missing humerus. They had not found the rest of the body. The cry came from Wetch's throat. He had immediately recognized the face I had just drawn. He collapses on the floor, repeating the same first name for several minutes. Warm tears streaming down his cheeks. A name that was then unknown to me. That of his brother, his younger brother, who had gone to work in the west of the country several months earlier. His brother was Kisquan. It took Westithhew a long time to calm down and managed to articulate understandable words other than his brother's name. It took the drawing I had just made from my hands as tenderly as possible. Despite the shock, his gestures were not abrupt, and he took the illustration with the greatest tenderness in the words. While his eyes could not stop moving back and forth between the bones and the drawing, his friends surrounding him as did the scientists of the expedition, who were also overwhelmed by shock and emotion. It is always difficult for a human being to be confronted in such a way with their fleeting states, a skeleton. Each bones remind us that our life is only temporary, that we are merely passing through, and being so close to these human remains seems to trouble our whole assembly deeply. Once everyone had recovered, I asked Guercissiu to tell us more about his brother and his supposed departure several months earlier, for, judging by the condition of the bones, he had surely never gone farther than a few kilometers from his native lands. Thus, his brother has supposedly left for the great Canadian West about 6 months earlier. Beavers were becoming increasingly rare, and he no longer wanted to hunt them. He had never liked doing so anyway. He loved them enormously and had an immense love for nature and the animals that inhabited it. So, he adored beavers. He was fascinated by their ability to create entire dams, and he loved spending all hours watching them carry branches towards their lodges to shape them. He hated hunting them and had argued with quite a few people in order to protect them, especially when they were baby beavers. The beavers' population has become extremely fragile. These animals were becoming rarer and rarer, and hunting them was becoming increasingly difficult, but fur allowed them to earn a living to survive by exchanging it for other goods they needed. He had often argued with his own brother as well, because Watsitsu was also a hunter, a very skilled one at that. His brother was a true defender of nature. He refused to destroy anything, even trees were not to be cut down, and yet many has been felled to make way for the new railway, for construction, or simply for heating and use in factories. Industrialization and modernization needed these trees to feed themselves, and this boy opposed it. He did everything he could to protect nature from humankind. He could spend entire hours observing the world around him, losing all senses of time and of the world in which he lived. He had left for the West in the hope of finding different work, far from hunting and lodging. It seemed he was looking for a job as a guide for a Westerner eager to discover Canadian nature. Foreigners and tourists who had left the city to immerse themselves in the forest for a few weeks. He had broken Wassissu's heart to see him live far from his family and his people, and he had taken a long time to accept his decision, only for him to die like this in the end. And that's all for today. Thank you so much for listening this episode until the end. I hope you like the episode, and if you do, please don't forget to leave us a like, subscribe, and share the podcast with others. Thank you again for listening, and see you very soon for new adventures with Annabelle Underwood.